for me, I like to be in a space where I can take some risks and I can try and explore new things. And so that relationship assures me that that person is kind of willing to go along on that roller coaster ride.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio-on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you knew one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now, on to my next guest, David Biedenbender. Hi, Dave.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for joining the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, Dave, can you introduce yourself for the listeners? Tell them what you do and where you are.
Yeah, so I live in East Lansing, Michigan. I'm an assistant professor of composition at Michigan State University. I teach composition and orchestration. I'm teaching a class on a notation engraving, but also music preparation and how to get your music out there and self-publish and all that. This is year 4 for me. And I am a native Michigander, kind of. I was born in Wisconsin, but I've lived here for a long time. I have a few degrees from the state of Michigan, undergrad at Central Michigan University, and then master's and doctorate from the University of Michigan. So I've been here for a while.
Excellent. So Dave, can you tell everyone about how you got started in music? What's your origin story as a musician?
Yeah, so I never really remember learning how to read music. My dad is a Lutheran pastor, both grandfathers actually are as well. And my mom was the church organist, still is a church organist. And I grew up watching her feet and fingers play the notes and following along the hymnal, and kind of learned to read music by just paying attention. And so I feel like, Lutheran hymnody, Bach chorales are sort of the backbone of my my musical self, my musical story. I started singing in the church choir, alto a bit, and then tenor and bass, and then picked up the trumpet in 7th grade. That was when we started instruments in my public school music program. I was terrible, and probably would have quit band or music in a formal sense if I had stuck with the trumpet. And my band director saw some potential and switched me to the euphonium my freshman year of high school, which was serendipitous because I really took to the instrument very quickly. I made the top ensemble and became principal that first year, and actually still play euphonium. Along the way through high school, I joined everything that had band in the name. Any opportunity I could to make music. I was in pep band, marching band, concert band. I was in the pit orchestra, and I picked up a couple other instruments along the way. The bass trombone for jazz band, the tuba and sousaphone for brass quintet, and later on in a New Orleans style brass band. And then I also picked up the electric bass. That started initially as playing like jazz and rock, and continue to do some of that as well. So a lot of the low end stuff. And I plan to be a pediatric neurosurgeon, actually. I was planning to go to the University of Michigan for pre-medicine, but my senior year of high school, I wrote a piece for my high school band, a 13.5-minute piece called Reflections on the Passion. And my high school band director, Matt Tayton, allowed me to conduct the premiere. We switched roles. I conducted and he played the euphonium, actually, a trumpet player that was playing euphonium in the premiere. And and I was totally hooked. So I took that piece to David Gillingham, who was teaching nearby at Central Michigan University, and ended up switching my plans my senior year of high school to become a music education major. And I went to Central Michigan intending to be a music education major.
That's a really, this is a story that comes through with a lot of composers. And I bring this up every time, the importance of band directors to give their creative students a chance to hear their music either being read, or in your case, it was premiered. And so what did that teacher, how did he see that in you? Had you written things for him before that?
So I got my start in composition kind of slowly and through arranging. I was arranging works for brass quintet and for my church, and started reharmonizing things. And that very first piece actually includes a lot of tunes that were not my own. It's kind of a combination of original melodic material and then hymn tunes that I had reharmonized and reorchestrated, and I think stretched enough that it was definitely an original composition. But along the way, several people really fostered my interest. David Gillingham came and worked with our high school band a number of times and was incredibly encouraging, enthusiastic, energetic, inspiring. And then Jen Grantham, who was one of my high school band directors, and then Matt Tayton both encouraged me to do more arranging. They were encouraging of my pursuits in music and just generally wonderful educators, inspiring educators. And then as I got deeper into arranging, Matt actually encouraged me to do more score study. We talked about music theory. He would give me scores and say, hey, take this piece home and take a look at the orchestration. I think you'll find it interesting. So they were really kind of just feeding, they were always up for a conversation. They were always up for chatting about my curiosities and answering my questions, and then, ultimately giving me opportunities to really make music early on. So I wouldn't be a composer if not for them.
So do you ever regret not being a pediatric neurosurgeon?
At times, I think I always joke around with my wife that I'm the wrong kind of doctor. I can't really help people with any kind of medical issues, but no, I mean, no real regrets. I love what I do. In fact, sometimes I have to pinch myself because, I wake up each day and teach wonderful students, and I get to write music. And, along the way, I also get to go to some meetings and talk about curriculum and stuff, which is the real work part of my job. But I love making music, and I love teaching. So
from that story there, it sounds like you knew after this piece was premiered that you were going to go, and you mentioned sending the score to David Gillingham. That's a name that a lot of my listeners will know. Can you talk about your time with him and what that was like?
Yeah. So he heard this first piece and immediately asked if I wanted to come study with him. I think I'd never had a composition lesson in my life, and I was so so kind of humbled that somebody had taken an interest in my work, and an enthusiastic interest in my work that I, of course, wanted to study with him. I mean, I've been playing his music since 8th grade. I remember playing, our marching band did an arrangement of Stained Glass, his incredible percussion ensemble piece. And, it was kind of strange. Like, I thought he was this famous composer, and he is, but he was also like the dad of my section leader, somebody that I would see watching us rehearse and who would stop by on occasion to check out and see what we were up to. So yeah, studying with him, I remember early on just really being encouraging. He's always, he's someone that I still reach out to and that will always say encouraging things. He gave me a lot of listening to do early on. And just really fostered my interest. I mean, he's one of those people that I wouldn't be doing this without his generosity and mentorship.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you remember from his teaching that you still use in your music today? Is there something that?
Yeah, good question. It's been a while. I studied with him 2003 to 7. I mean, this happens a lot, and I think it's a really good thing. I actually encourage my students to do this. Good teachers are teaching their students to teach themselves. And ultimately, the things that you tell your students should be things that become part of their become part of their routine, part of the way they think. You should become the voice in their head. And so it's funny, there are things that all of my teachers have told me that that I almost think of as like my own, because at some point they kind of did become who I am. I remember. I think one of the things that was really powerful for me is David juxtaposes like disparate elements at times. One of my favorite pieces of his is Heroes Lost and Fallen, and his ability to take these familiar tunes and juxtapose them with material that's dissonant or strange, and kind of find these spaces where these two different materials can meet, I think was really striking to me. He also has a really brilliant sense of texture. One of my favorite pieces for band is his it's more than an arrangement, but his Beat on My Vision. And there's a massive euphonium solo in that I love playing. And part of the beauty of that piece is he takes that tune and transforms it, plays it in Phrygian and in major, and does these beautiful modulations in the orchestration. I mean, he explores all of these different colors. So those are things that I learned from him, and also from studying his scores and playing his music.
When did you first know that you were going to sort of write pieces for band? I know you have about 10 band pieces. Now you write many other things, and we're going to talk about that. But when was that first time in your graduate studies that you said, oh, band is something I really want to keep writing for?
Yeah, interesting question, because I wrote that first piece as a senior in high school, and then I actually didn't write anything for band as an undergraduate. I didn't write anything for band while studying with Gillingham. And, it's funny, my memory is foggy. I don't know if it's because I just chose not to, or if he encouraged me not to. I think one of the biggest struggles I had early on as a composer was developing my material. And something I realized, whether intuitively or through his instruction, something I now try to balance with my own students, is that it can be very useful to study development techniques to try to understand your material in contexts that are smaller, namely chamber music. When you're not having to worry about orchestrating a chord, it's a lot easier to understand the potential of your material. So the first piece that I wrote after that, so that my very first piece for band was 2003. The next piece was 2008, and it's actually a transcription of my own work. I was selected for a workshop with Eighth Blackbird, famous new music ensemble, sextet, and wrote them a piece called Stomp, and decided, I think it was for the Frank DeKelly. There was a Frank DeKelly composition competition through Manhattan Beach. I can't remember if that's still going now or not, but I decided to arrange that piece to transcribe it for that competition, and kind of did so in a 3-4 day frenzy, and orchestrated it, and then dedicated it to my undergraduate conductor, John Williamson, who was also an incredibly important influence. I can talk about him for a long time and would love to talk about him more in relationship to a recent piece. But Stomp I dedicated to him, and he gave the premiere of that in 2009. Around the same time, I was commissioned to write a piece by National Lutheran Honors Band. And given that it was a Lutheran honor band, I thought, why not connect it to Bach in some way? And so decided to use this tune, Break Forth, O Beauteous Heavenly Light, that Bach also set, and is a pretty popular hymn around Christmas time, and decided to kind of create a fantasy on that tune. And out of that came Luminescence. So those were my first two pieces post undergrad in grad school, where I was writing for band. Both of those pieces are fairly challenging, kind of written for upper high school, college level bands. So yeah.
What happened next? Can you just kind of fill in the blanks for me a little bit as far as your career goes? Because I know that you have as you mentioned, you have a diverse kind of composition portfolio.
Yeah. So, it's funny. I think in in band music, the community itself moves very quickly. Developing repertoire happens at kind of a breakneck pace compared to most other mediums. I mean, especially if you can compare it to orchestra. The amount of time it takes for a composition to become kind of standard or given that elusive and problematic masterpiece status. It takes a long time. Like in recent memory, I feel like Jennifer Higdon's Blue Cathedral and Chris Theophanidis's Rainbow Body have sort of achieved that. But even that took it seemed to have taken like a decade or more. The band community moves very fast. With that said, I feel like I've been on a little bit of a slow burn. So I wrote those pieces in 2008 and 2009, and performances really didn't take off of those pieces. I mean, I had a couple of performances each year for a few years, basically folks that I had reached out to, met along the way, connections that some of my mentors, had given me, and went from the master's program, took a year off, I taught music theory at Oakland University, adjunct, and got my first commission that year. My second commission that year, because Luminescence was their first official commission. Got my first chamber music commission, and I lucked out. So much of music and life is being in the right place at the right time. I got offered a gig to teach at Interlochen Center for the Arts, and taught music theory there for a summer, and met a saxophonist named Tim McAllister, who is amazing.
Yep. He can play his horn a little bit.
He can, and he's a member of the Prism Saxophone Quartet, which is, I think probably the best saxophone quartet in the world. And he asked me, one of his students at Interlochen was playing a saxophone sonata that I had written, and he was really impressed with it. And he asked if I would write a piece for his quartet. I said, absolutely, when do you need it? And then proceeded to be absolutely terrified, because I was very intimidated to write for this amazing ensemble, for these amazing musicians, and had no idea what I was going to do. But that year I wrote, it's a piece called You've Been Talking in Your Sleep, which is about my wife sleep talking. And that was about it. I didn't write a whole lot else, but used that piece and applied to doctoral programs, and started my doctorate in 2010 at the University of Michigan. And the next band piece that came along was in 2011. I was at a party with my wife, who did her music education degree at Michigan, and she introduced me to a friend of hers named Ryan Shaw. And Ryan was a high school band director in Cedar Springs, Michigan, and asked if I would be interested in writing a band piece. And he put together a consortium of high school bands with the express intent that the piece would be for the second band, the second band at every school. Kind of grade 3 was sort of the target. But the idea was that, the top bands at a lot of high schools get some great opportunities, and this was going to be a piece for that second band, something really special. And so really great group of band directors got together and put together this consortium with Ryan, and I wrote Melodious Thunk. And again, kind of a slow burn. I felt like that piece didn't take off right away. The members of the consortium played it, and they really seemed to like it. But what really kind of changed things, I think, for me, was a performance of Melodious Thunk at the Midwest Band and Orchestra Clinic. And it was a middle school band, McCracken Middle School outside of Chicago. Incredible group. And they played it.
That's Chip DiStefano.
That's right. Chip's, yeah, incredible. Yeah. 2013 or 14, he did that piece at Midwest, and I could tell pretty quickly that it had made an impact there. It shortly thereafter got picked up by North Texas, and they put it on an album and included it in the Teaching Music Through Performance series, the book. And then alongside that, other people started picking up Stomp and Luminescence. So things kind of picked up after that.
All right, David. So the story of Melodious Thunk is interesting to me because that's the piece that I first knew your name from. I remember, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, probably more like 5 years ago, seeing that piece, hearing that piece on the internet and going, oh, wow, this is a great one, and seeing your name and, doing all that stuff. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that, specifically the use of jazz elements, because that's also something you use in Stomp. So can you talk about bringing in and using popular music in your band works?
Yeah. So, this is something that I tell all of my students and something that I think about a lot. It's important to be honest, to be authentic, to be yourself. And your influences and your experiences should make it into your work. That's something you have to tell some people, and other people just kind of seem to get it right off the bat. For me, I think it was a bit of a learning process, but I had a couple of teachers that were really great about emphasizing and giving me confidence that all parts of myself can be in my work. And so, I mentioned starting on trumpet and euphonium, but around the same time I was picking up the bass, and I started this band with a friend, and we were kind of doing like a rock band thing, and it wasn't going very well. And we made a hard left turn into jazz and started a jazz combo, and actually played all through high school, and did jazz competitions, and played a ton of gigs. I actually had a weekly gig as a high school student, like a weekly paying gig, food and money, actual money. So I played a lot of jazz in high school and then in undergrad. And it's kind of, I mentioned Bach, like learning how to read music and having the chorales in my ear. I think just as much jazz is a part of my musical DNA. So it comes out in various ways, sometimes really overt and very on the sleeve, and at other times it's more underneath the surface. One of the things that I like to do is to kind of find connections between seemingly disparate musical styles or elements. So for me, Melodious Thunk really comes out of my experiences as a bass player, bass trombonist. I was taking an American music class at that time and heard this great anecdote about Thelonious Monk and his wife referring to him as Melodious Thunk. And I've always admired his playing. He's just, I think one of the things I really admire is that it's not always was not always the most virtuosic pianist, but he's certainly incredibly stylistic and interesting. And some of the elements of his playing that I find most interesting are like the pointillism of it, the gestural pointillism, how he kind of threads elements of music together that are often that may seem disconnected, but they're actually quite connected. Like he can play single eighth note, sort of pointy lines in both hands, and they come together to make this beautiful landscape, rich, harmonically interesting. And of course, all of his wrong notes too, which he makes right notes. So I was hearing that anecdote and thinking about his persona and his wonderful elements of his music. And that was kind of the sudden inspiration for Melodious Thunk. I was, of course, trying to come up with an idea and had this idea of using the kind of pointillism of Thelonious Monk to create this groovy piece. So the first part of Melodious Thunk is the first part that I wrote. And then I realized that part was really hard and wanted the piece to kind of take off and become more melodic and to groove more. So I think of it as the piece kind of assembles itself. All of these little motifs assemble themselves and eventually coalesce, a minute or so into this kind of groove and melody. And interestingly, it's a question I didn't anticipate having to answer so often, but the big quotation in the piece is actually Salt Peanuts, which is not a Thelonious Monk tune. but I was looking, I don't know, that's like one of my favorite tunes that I used to play in high school jazz band. And I thought it was just kind of so quirky and interesting. And I harmonize it in minor seconds in the piece. And so anyway, there's a prominent Salt Peanuts quote in that piece, even though that's not Thelonious Monk.
So this is a grade 3 piece, mostly, you think?
Allegedly. Yeah. I mean, some middle schools have done it. We could talk grade levels and sort of what that comprises, but I did run a lot of the elements of the piece past music educator friends and performer friends that were kind of gauging and thinking about, young players as I asked them for feedback, thinking about fingerings of hard passages and stuff. I think the hardest thing about this piece is the first minute, and particularly the rests. People you have to count, and you can't step in the potholes. And this is kind of true of a lot of like kind of landmark pieces. And I'm not saying Melodious Thunk is a landmark piece, but there are pieces that come along and push the sense of what's possible in a medium. And I think something that happens a lot is we come to expect certain kinds of gestures and textures in a medium. And I think Blue Shades definitely is a piece, and there's relationships between this piece and that. I think like there are things that we haven't seen before that when we see it's like, wow, that's really hard. But like a few years goes by and it's no longer hard, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So this piece is played a lot, and people don't think of it, I think, as hard as it once was,
We're in the weeds now, composer-wise, so let's dive in a little bit more. So you do teach composition, and so what sort of what's your basic philosophy as a composer or as a teacher of composition, and also what might you want to share with my listeners who might be thinking about writing some music of their own? Yeah,
so my teaching centers on helping students to articulate what their intentions are, and to kind of put a mirror in front of them. So, somewhat Socratic, like, okay, tell me what you want to do. And then I repeat that back. Cause sometimes people don't actually understand what it is they're trying to do with their music. And then I think about myself as trying to help them achieve those goals and giving them technique, for lack of a better word, to kind of make sure that they are actually accomplishing aesthetically what they set out to accomplish. Along the way, I assign listening and score study. We have lots of discussion aesthetically. There's also elements of my teaching that center on or end up in entrepreneurship and talking about venues for getting your work out there and making further connections and finding future collaborators and things like that. But really what I'm most interested in is helping students figure out who they are, what they want to say musically, and then helping them to say that better. And so a couple of teachers were really formative for me. I'll give just a couple of quick anecdotes. Another teacher actually from my undergrad, Jose Luis Martua, I remember I was writing this orchestra piece, and we spent an entire lesson on one measure of music, and specifically on the orchestration of it, and mostly on percussion. He was trying to get me to understand how important it is to think about the details of a moment and how much can be packed into just a single moment, actually. And I remember him recommending that I put bass drum on the downbeat and then this clave on another part, and just all these really detailed things that just made that bar incredible. And then him saying, okay, all right, do that to the rest of the piece. And me feeling like this level of detail was something I had never encountered before. Something that was like, wow, I could approach every single note with this kind of thoughtfulness. Another story that comes to mind is Evan Chambers, who I studied with at the University of Michigan. He talked a lot about being yourself and understanding who you are and making sure that comes up through in your music. But one of the things he brought up a lot was like, the first thing that people hear should pull them in. Your first millisecond should be captivating. It should be something that makes people want to know more. And again, that's, I think, kind of a detail thing. It's like, what are you going to try to say right up front that makes people just need to keep listening to the piece? And then I think one of the things I got from her was being able to be self-reflective about my process. I no longer say that I have writer's block because of Kristen. There is only work. And if you work, you can make terrible material, which I write a lot, into something good. And so I don't ever stop writing. I just keep working. And I'm so grateful to her for that. And then the last person is Michael Doherty. And one of the things that I learned from Michael, I think, is a real sense of kind of development of material. He has a real way of taking material and taking it very far. And so for my students, I've kind of distilled development techniques down. I actually have like a sheet that I give them on day one, and it's a list of development techniques. It sounds really sterile and technical and music theoretical, I guess, in some ways. It's things like retrograde, inversion, diminution, augmentation, changing registers, changing textures, transposition, modulation, transposition, but not tonal transposition, all kinds of development techniques. And what I try to get my students to do is to understand that once they've written some material, the answer to what comes next is probably already on the page if they ask the right questions. So you have to understand the potential of your material, and that often lies in very simple transformations of that material using these development techniques. And there are techniques that composers for hundreds of years have been using. The trick, the key, is to transform it in just the right way, to kind of pick the right transformations, the right developments of the material, and rearrange the puzzle pieces in the right way. But that's something I try to guide my students through, is to understand the potential of the material. That they don't need many ideas, often just one, and they just need to understand the potential of it.
So it's interesting you talk about development, because, when you teach young kids especially, development is difficult for them to play. And so most young band music tends to be expositional and non-developmental. And it's only as we get into older band music that we see more developmental material. So what do you think about all of that stuff as far as band music goes?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because part of the levels of difficulty is that some of it's durational and some of it is, in fact, like, what are you doing with the material? And if you want to keep the piece at an accessible level, having basically just that material and not departing from it is really critical. I think the thing that I stress with my students, and that I always set out in my own writing when I'm writing for young ensembles, is that the idea that I come up with has to be really good, has to be one that I want to live with for a while. It's probably the only idea I get. And furthermore, I also develop the piece around the playability of it. So what I mean by that is, like, if you come up with an idea and the idea itself is just way too hard to be executed, then it's kind of a bad starting point for a young band piece. I try to build the playability of the piece into the material. Or better said, I try to make sure that I have a great idea that just happens to be easy to play. So I try to start with, something that I think is playable, and then I give it to friends and ask them if it works well on the instrument. And I'll even go so far as early on, and I like to do it early on before I get too far in the piece, I'll even do transpose it or change tempos, or like fundamentally build the piece on a playable idea for young players.
Yeah, it's interesting because, there are a lot of pieces that have some development for young players. It's mostly like in counter melodies or in bass lines or in contrasting sections, I'm just going to use an anecdote that my listeners who teach young band may know, is I'm doing a piece by Michael Sweeney that's just a grade 1. So it's first year players or end of first year players, just an octave in range. And it's called Celtic Air and Dance. It's the first one he wrote. And as I kind of hum those melodies in my head, especially in the fast part of it, they're all related. They're all sort of based on that same motivic material, that same germinal material that the first melody he introduces there has. And so it's possible to do it in these pieces. So as a band director, you can look for that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you can follow your gut to some extent and stuff, but there are not every piece that comes out is a great piece. And some of the things you're saying is relevant to what to look for. So,
well, no, it's really true. And what I like to think about is it's like, I mean, we have a filter of 300 years since Bach's time. Bach wasn't the most famous composer of, 1715.
Right.
There were many more who were famous than him who we don't know about.
Right.
Yes, Handel we know about, but that's one. Mm-hmm. Corelli, yeah, that's two. But you get the point. You understand.
Right.
We don't have that filter of history. So of course there's a lot of Dross and Drek coming across. It's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
Time will filter them.
Yeah. That's a good thing to bring up. We don't have to talk about that, but that's a good thing to bring up in terms of commission culture. Uh-huh. I think band folks kind of understand it pretty well, but you have to build in a certain amount of failure, a certain amount, that's harsh, but you have to build in a certain amount of expectation that not every piece you commission is going to be the next greatest work. That is like how building repertoire works. And we get a false impression from music history. But for exactly the reasons you're saying, we only get to know the good stuff.
How about your music itself? I know we've talked about some of your pieces, Stomp and Melodious, Thunk, but are your current band pieces, and I see you have about 10, are they currently self-published, commercially published? How do you handle that?
Yeah, good question. So early on, I had a couple teachers kind of issuing the warning bells. David Gillingham talking about a piece with a publisher that they didn't want to print because it wasn't selling quite enough copies to be worth printing. This was before digital distribution. But they also didn't want to release the copyright. And so there were people that wanted to play this piece that just couldn't. And Michael Dougherty also has done a number of things. He was with Boozy for a number of years, and then went self-published for a little while. And I believe now he's working with Bill Holub, which brings me to what I do. So I was pretty adamant early on about keeping my copyright, about retaining the intellectual ownership of my work. And so I set out intending to self-publish. Around 2013, I wrote my saxophone concerto, and a guy named Sean Murphy approached me and asked if I'd be interested in publishing. He actually was a co-commissioner of that piece and asked me if I was interested in publishing my saxophone music with him. And the premise was that he was basically going to be a printer and distributor, but I would retain my copyright, which is something that Bill Holub does for a lot of composers. Joel Puckett is with him. I believe Chris Theophanidis might be. Michael is now. Number of folks. And I said yes. I was looking for a way to get my saxophone music out there, and he was planning to present at conferences and such. And I also recommended to him around that same time that he explored the possibility of taking on band pieces. And he said yes. And it was right around the same time that Melodious Thunk was starting to take off. It was shortly after Midwest. And I was having a hard time keeping up with printing and shipping that piece. And so he took on Melodious Thunk at that time, and Luminescence and Stomp. And I've been working with Sean ever since. So Sean has my saxophone band and now brass catalog. And basically, it's kind of this newer publishing model. It's non-traditional. I retain my copyright. Sean prints and distributes the music. We do mostly print, some digital in a pinch. And it's been a great relationship. I really like working with Sean. And one of the things I'm really proud of with Sean is that he's cultivated, I think, an interesting catalog of band and saxophone composers that's particularly diverse. There's a lot of different kinds of voices. And I think he's doing a lot to to deepen and broaden the voices that are present in the band community. And I think that's catching on. I think people are starting to know his work and his catalog. So,
well, that's something that was really of concern to me when I started to think about publishing band music. Is, it was trying to get my name out there a little bit, and so I went the other way. I decided to go with a commercial publisher for that reason. And I'm not sure if I made the right decision or not, but I certainly don't mind not doing the work of printing and mailing and all that stuff.
Yeah, I hate that element of it. I don't like printing and shipping and responding to emails and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And in terms of advice for young composers, it's an interesting time. I don't have a clear pathway that I would say is the best way for everybody. Because major publishers still have incredible distribution networks, especially for grades like 1 through 3. And I think there's some real advantages to at least thinking that through. There are a number of folks that actually do kind of a hybrid model. Tyler Grant, from what I understand, he does grade 1 through 3 stuff generally with FJH, and then I think his upper level stuff he does with he does self-publishing. He might work with Sean too now, actually.
I think he might. Yeah, and in fact, Tyler, that was the first time I'd ever heard of that. Was when I interviewed Tyler on the show. He said that he talks about that in his interview.
And I think Tyler's really made that work. I think that's worked really well for him. So.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that. It's really the grade level. Typically middle school band directors aren't looking for independent composers as much because, it's a harder grade level to get into as an independent composer.
Well, and there's some basic business things like early on when I was selling Melodious Thunk directly, filling out a 1099 for every single one, every single order. And then folks would have issues where their district wouldn't allow them to purchase from vendors that weren't already set up in the system. And so sometimes the amount of overhead was just not worth it for some folks. And they would just say, I'm sorry, if it's not on Pepper, I'm just not ordering, So.
And there's problems with that too. I mean, I don't know how many people know, but to get your music sold through someone like Pepper, there's deals that are made there too, where you're giving money away. And
yes,
so it's really tricky. It's more complicated than just, what it seems on the surface.
I and Sean would always prefer that folks are ordering directly from him. He tries to make it as easy as possible, but the more people we get involved in the middle, the more complicated it gets. So.
All right, David. So what does it look like to commission a work from you? If I were a high school or a college and I said, I really want to get a work from David Biedenbender, what would that look like for me?
So one of the reasons I'm doing music, and this has taken a little while to admit and to understand about myself, is that, I love sound. I love making sounds. Scores are an instruction for sound. But the thing I love, and it's sort of timely given that we're all apparently going to be socially distancing ourselves. I'm teaching remotely for the next month and a half. The thing I love about music is working with other people. I love this idea that I can put notes down on a page and that someone else will make them better than I could possibly have imagined, that they'll find phrases and nuances and things there that I didn't anticipate, the good surprises, and so I love working with people. And as a result, when I'm looking to take on new projects, for me, it's about establishing trust and establishing a relationship with someone. And that can come about in a number of different ways. I love working with people that have done my music before and have been collaborative and either wanted to collaborate through a rehearsal or a Skype session or a residency. I want to get a sense that they're invested in what I'm doing, that they're commissioning me because they like what I'm doing as a composer. So for me, it's a lot about relationships. And that's kind of, that's a wishy-washy answer about commissioning, because I get a fair number of requests, but I think the things that really ultimately end up coming to fruition are projects where there's trust there and there's a relationship there, and both ends are willing to follow through and stuff. So
So, David, we've talked a lot about your band music, but I've already also mentioned that you have a diverse catalog. So tell me a little bit about the rest of what you're writing.
Yeah, so one of the things that I found to be true for me is that when I work in different mediums, it causes me to kind of think differently. I'm studying different pieces. I've got different sounds in my ear. I actually orchestrate a lot along the way. And so I'll often tell my students, don't think about which note you want to write. Think about which note you want to write, who plays it, how they play it, because all of those things contribute to the meaning of that note. And as a result, I really find it to be helpful for me to have different kinds of projects in different mediums that are going to cause me to think obliquely, to think about problems from different perspectives. So as much as possible, I like to not write a piece in the same medium in the same year. I do a lot of chamber music. Actually, my catalog is probably, I haven't done the tally, but majority of it is chamber music. Some of that also just comes from, I love when you write chamber music, you work with people closely and you can get to know them better than when you're working with a large ensemble where it's challenging to kind of to appreciate each person in the ensemble and what they're bringing to it. Usually you're brought in at the last minute for rehearsal and there's so many people involved. So I love the aspects of chamber music where I get to know the players and they bring a lot to the table and it's very transparent. And I feel like writing chamber music, writing choral music, doing some electronic work, I feel like those things make me a better composer, and as a result, make me a better composer for band. I feel refreshed, like I have more ideas when I've worked in another medium for a bit. So I try to space projects out and intersperse them.
Yeah, it's interesting because before I started recording, you and I talked about that, there's some people who really believe in niching into a field and niching into an area. And I guess, it's like everything else. It's like publishing. It's what your comfort level is as an individual, because we're all different.
Yeah. Well, and there's a number of factors that go into that. I mean, one, I will say, to really make an impact in a particular medium, I think you have to be part of that community. So for me, I spend a good amount of time. I've invested a lot of time being part of the band community. I go to conferences, I meet people, I go to performances. I feel like, and I try very hard to be part of that community and connect with people. It's what I love about doing this. And that in itself pushes people, I think, to kind of specialize. You cultivate relationships in a particular field, and it's easy to just follow those pathways. It takes a lot more work to cultivate those pathways in, 5 different directions. One of the things I will say from a pragmatic perspective, economic perspective, even, if folks are looking to do a career in composition, I think focusing on a particular medium can be really helpful because it can focus your work and you can build things maybe more quickly there. For me, my career in teaching gives me a little bit of latitude, a little bit of, it's some privilege to be able to kind of take a break from a medium for a little while and come back to it. And, I think that's some of what I enjoy about teaching is that I can space my projects out a little bit more and pace myself a bit.
So, David, something that a lot of teachers or band directors out there are interested in when they hear from composers is, what's it like to write a new piece? And so what is your process when you start a new piece?
Yeah, so I think a lot about process because I think it helps me connect with and mentor my students better. One thing that I believe in is finding a twist or even a different process for each piece, some element that makes me feel slightly uncomfortable. The idea being that if I change my process, it will also change the outcome. Now, there are elements of my process that I want to be able to trust and to be able to fall back on. But I'll give you a couple of examples. So this took some discovery. It's nothing earth-shattering at all, but just self-discovery. I will often make notes, voice memos on my phone, things that are kind of nascent, like this is how the piece is going to feel and taste. And this is kind of the piece in a faraway, distant cloud. And then from there, I often will start singing, maybe playing some of my instruments and trying out material there, sitting at the piano. And I will often ask people to record little bits and pieces, or I'll record things myself. And then I jump often to Logic, the software Logic, where I can juxtapose like entering MIDI with recordings. And a number of times I give myself like a different sort of charge, but one of the things I like to think about is trying to treat the piece as though it's an electronic piece for a little while. What kinds of processes would I apply to an electronic piece to develop my material or to make it interesting? And I'll start there and then transcribe it to staff paper or to a notation software. And so I try to put like the other thing I like about Logic is I'm able to improvise. My background in jazz, when I sit down to write and I ask myself what note comes next, it's kind of a paralyzing question. The thought that this A flat is going to be one that's going to be scrutinized and performed and practiced and questioned and played by people makes me nervous. So the thing I like to do is to sit down and just play and improvise and take that pressure off and just get back to what I love, which is making sounds. And so I make sounds that I love, and making that in an improvisatory fashion, and then looping it and improvising over that material and improvising it over and over again makes the process feel like I'm kind of improvising as opposed to composing. It feels like play, which is really critical. And then from there, once I've kind of developed some material, I jump into those development techniques and try to discover what the possibilities are. What else is there that I haven't discovered or seen yet? So that's a little bit about the process. There's lots of other things that go into it, but gives you a sense of kind of where I'm coming from. So,
remember your first term of teaching, learning all the skills that you don't get taught in music school, managing a transitioning culture in your classroom, finding out that you have to teach guitar this term? During those early years, we found out that leaning on a community of music educators was important, not only for building that knowledge in ourselves, but also maintaining enough sanity to serve the students right in front of us. Amused is a podcast centered around a community of music teachers. Between the four of us, we teach choir, band, orchestra, general, jazz, and marching band at the elementary through collegiate levels. We certainly don't have all the answers, but you're welcome to listen in while we try to find them. Join us while we work through the challenges of music teaching and celebrate the joy of bringing music making into the lives of young people. In each episode, you'll hear stories, both good and bad, about that week of teaching, and we'll try and tackle an issue that one of us is struggling with. Something we're all taught is that music brings people together, but being the only teacher in your subject at a site can be really isolating. We think everyone ought to be a part of a community, and you're welcome to come join ours. Episodes come out on Wednesdays during the school year, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at amusedcast.org.
All right, David. So I won't call this a lightning round because these questions are big philosophical questions for the most part. And so the first of these is, where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
That's a good question. It's a line that I've found both sides of myself. I think I try to frame music as really not a competition as much as possible, and to think about it as a community, one that can really help each other, along. I think it's important to find ways to work hard, and as a result, I try to focus as much on intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic motivation. I try to find ways to motivate myself that really fulfill me and that make me feel like I'm doing my best work. And I offer that advice to my students. I enter competitions and I do things that are competitive, and I get caught up in those things sometimes, but I try as much as possible to be motivated by the core of the reason I'm doing this, which is to make music with people that I like. And so in terms of drawing a line, I think anytime something causes me to lose sight of what's really important, then it's an unhealthy amount of competition, because the truth is it's a small world. We're all in this together. We can all work together. And if something has caused me to lose sight of the beauty of our community, then I need to draw a line.
One thing that musicians and music teachers tend to struggle with is the idea of a work-life balance. How do you find a work-life balance, or do you?
Early on, I used to think that inspiration only came to me in the middle of the night, sometime between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. And that was fun when I was in grad school and when I was younger, and when pulling an all-nighter or being nocturnal was an option, or my body felt like it was an option. It really isn't anymore. And, this relates back to some of the things I worked through with Kristen Custer. And it's just that if you show up and do the work, you'll be inspired. There's a Jack London quote, you can't wait for inspiration. You have to go after it with a club. So for me, one of the things that has helped work-life balance is scheduling composing time. It varies a little bit depending with my teaching schedule and what's going on with work, family life. But generally now, as a person that's not really a morning person, I have found that I'm freshest in the morning. And so I try to wake up early, 5:30, 6 o'clock, something like that, and compose for a couple hours in the morning. And I encourage the same thing for my students. If I write even a note in the morning, I have composed for the day, and it is a successful day, and it will be easier to compose tomorrow if I've written today. Then throughout the day, if I have little breaks, which often happens to a lot of us, right? No matter what you're doing, I'm teaching a lot. And so I get these like 10, 15-minute breaks throughout the day where it seems like the only thing I could do is email or Facebook or something. And I'm able to use that 10, 15-minute block to pick up where I left off. Because I started early in the morning. So achieve work-life balance. I mean, one of the things that I believe in is making sure your priority list is also your to-do list. For a long time, I would save my composing, which was one of my top priorities. I'd save it for last. And now I try to make it first. And I think that really helps work toward that. It's a learning process for everyone, I'm sure. So.
All right, David, what are the challenges facing music education and band, and how can we best meet them?
One is I think it's really important to program music from a lot of different voices. This is happening, but slowly. I think it's happening in some communities more than in others. But there are a lot of great composers out there writing great music, and there's lots of ways to find them. There's the Composer Diversity Database that Rob Deemer and company run. I think Sean Murphy's doing a great job with this. A lot of major publishers are doing this now too. Ryan Balmages announced the FGH lineup of orchestral composers for the year, and there's just so many great and diverse voices there. And some of that comes back to like stories that I hear from students and friends. Viet Quang, a good friend of mine, actually one of my best friends, he often says how, representation really matters. When he goes out and works with students, there are students that just really light up to see him in the room because they have not seen people like him represented, often enough. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to be working on. I think that's definitely part of the larger conversation, but I still hear and see some things that are, I hear and see a lot of room for improvement. Along similar lines a little bit, I think one challenge is that it's a larger education challenge is accessibility economically. There's a lot of programs that can afford to have great training up through all the levels and everything. And so band is kind of expensive in some ways. And, there's a lot of schools, like there were a lot of cuts in the economic crisis in 2008. My wife was on the front lines of this as an elementary music teacher and saw all these jobs disappear. We have to find ways to reach out to students to make music accessible. I really believe as an educator and as a composer that there's a tremendous power in making music in a group. There's some movement to, even getting rid of band and or large ensemble work because of the expense. I think that would be unfortunate because there are very few things we do nowadays in a large group where everybody's contribution matters, and we do it at the same time. I mean, there's some kind of really cool video of a band and a band director. I can't remember who it is, but he says, I want everybody to play the piece, and they play the piece. And then he says, I want everybody to play the piece, and we're going to all give 95%. And it sounds terrible, you know?
That might be the Jack Stamp lecture.
Yeah. And I just, I think there's something really beautiful and powerful about coming together and making music in a group. And so I think we need to find ways to make that possible in all kinds of communities.
I just had Damian Crutcher on, and he's got his Crescendo Detroit.
He's doing it. Yeah.
Man, making music in a community. That's exactly it.
Yep.
All right. So, David, I have a time machine, and I set it to the day of your high school graduation. What are you telling yourself?
This is a tough one. Chill out. Everything will be okay. I think, I don't know. So, I think I was really worked up early on. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of anxiety that goes into a career in music. I mean, heck, I came from a family of pastors and teachers, where and my wife comes from a family of grew up on a farm. There's kind of a sense of like what you can make a career in music, and I think there was a lot of anxiety about like what it would be like to make a career in music. And, I have no illusions. It is still hard, and I've been very fortunate, very privileged. And there are a lot of people that, make a career in portfolio ways, they kind of put it together in a lot of different ways. So I'm not saying that it's not a hard thing. I think sometimes it's good to take a breath and to appreciate this gift that we have, and that we get to make music, and to understand that it's okay to make it in different ways, and to have a number of different approaches. And I think I would tell my younger self to chill out a bit, and maybe I'd have a little more hair. Maybe not. So.
Yeah, no, that's an answer I get a lot. That's an answer I get a lot, because I think it's, that's something you learn the longer you're in it, is it's a long career.
Yeah, it is. I've been thinking a lot about sustainability, and sustainability of careers for my students. And also, I brought up community a lot, but like appreciating community, because I think the younger self thought there were elements of competition that were there that just weren't, or that I had created in my head. And there are friends that I'm glad I didn't compete with too much, because they mean so much to me. They keep me on track, they keep me focused, they keep me sane.
All right, David. So I asked this question not for your favorite piece, but the one that's most meaningful. And the way I frame it is, if you could plan it out, what would be the final work that you'd like to hear or conduct, or not compose, but someone else's work, and why?
I was going to overthink this, and there's so many pieces that I love, but I'm going to go with something really simple. Every night before my sons go to bed, I sing them a number of songs, and one of them is an old hymn called "Abide with Me," and that's the first thing that came to my mind. So I'll just go with that.
All right, that's that's a strong choice. I've gotten everything for that answer, and usually it's a band piece. Mm-hmm. But, I've gotten, symphonies and chamber music and hymns and things like that as well. So how about a piece of yours? Like if someone were listening to the show and they don't know your name at all and they wanted to know your music, what piece would you point them to?
I hope this isn't too long of an answer. I think a lot of people know me through Melodious Thunk. And I hope I'm not a one hit wonder. I'm tempted to say, so I have this piece called Cyclotron that I'm really, really proud of, that is very, very different from most of the other stuff I've done. It's for band. I would say that, or one piece I'm really, really proud of that I did recently is called Severance. It's a saxophone quartet concerto. So maybe I'll kind of I'll put that one up at the top. I feel like that piece has a lot of me in it, and my different faces in it. So that's a piece that means a lot to me.
Is there anything coming up you'd like to share or promote?
Well, maybe. I don't know. There's a number of things that might get canceled.
Right. So let's frame this, since it's a podcast and it's going to exist, in time. So we're recording this at the in March of 2020, and of course the COVID-19 virus is been declared a pandemic and things are being canceled. So now go ahead, David.
Yeah. So I'll be finishing soon a piece, actually a grade 3 piece. It's for Rachel Maxwell, incredible middle school band director outside of Chicago. She's awesome. A friend of mine, a colleague, Aris Golden, connected me to Rachel. So writing a piece for her. And as far as I know, that will be premiering later in April. I forget the date exactly, April 20 something, but that's coming up. And then also a new piece for Tim McAllister, the saxophonist I mentioned earlier in the podcast. And fingers crossed, that's supposed to premiere in May in Europe and in New York City. We'll see. We'll see if that happens. But.
All right, David, how can people get in touch with you?
Email's good. My website is, davidbiedenbender.com. The name's difficult to spell, but if you get close, I think it'll take you there. Facebook, Instagram. I'm on Twitter at Dave Bede, Bied. Any number of those ways. I'm happy to chat. So,
excellent, Dave. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate your questions.